Fantastic set of presentations earlier, and in the previous panels, we looked at the Saudi-Iranian rivalry, and we looked at an incredible form of looking at the discourse and this debate, whether it's strategy, instrumentalist, and so on, and the issues regarding that. And I think Adam gave us a good point of departure for this panel and the themes that will be discussing that will be discussed in this panel. And I think what I find very fascinating about this panel is that it's going to shed light on another aspect of sectarianism that takes place that a lot of the times tends to look at Saudi Arabia, Iran, Sunni and Shiite. And I think with this panel, what I think, and I know everybody will find this very fascinating, is that there are different arenas that sectarianism takes place, and so we're very looking forward to this. So, of course, our first panelist will be Marta Babinska from the University. Babinska, yes, sorry. From the University of Lodz, and her work on defining and identifying Middle Eastern Christian communities in Europe. We are not Muslims, sectarian and post-sectarian identities of Assyrians, Syriac, and Sweden. So just for everyone, any questions, please use the Q&A function for their panelists. Keep an eye on the chat. I'll let you know when it's about 15 minutes so you could begin to conclude. And Marta, please, off you go whenever you're ready.
Thank you, Aziz. Good afternoon. I hope everyone enjoyed the lunch or other meal, depending on the time zone. The paper I'm going to present is a tiny part of a bigger European project entitled Defining and Identifying Middle Eastern Christian Communities in Europe, conducted by the researchers from the United Kingdom, led by Dr. Fiona McCallum from St. Andrews, Denmark, led by Dr. Lise Peusen-Galal from Roskilde University, and from Poland. I was responsible for the Swedish fieldwork. The project officially finished in 2015. Since then, we've published lots of articles. You'll find the links on our website. You can also see the cover of my habilitation book, Assyrian Syriac Diaspora in Sweden. Frankly speaking, I haven't used the word sectarian or sectarianism in the whole book. However, when I encountered Mustafa and Aziz called for papers, I thought I will look at my material once more to see it from a new perspective. Anyway, I should start by explaining who are modern Assyrian Syriacs. They are Middle Eastern Christians originating from the lands of today's Iran, Iraq, Syria, and Turkey. For centuries, they were identified themselves in religious terms, such as Jacobites and Nestorians, but we avoid such terms now as derogatory ones and rather speak about the members of a Syriac Orthodox Church, Assyrian Church of the East, or Chaldean Catholic Church. Under the Ottomans, the millet system reinforced the nominational and or sectarian identities of above mentioned. Among 17 millets that existed prior to the World War I, there was Syriac Orthodox, Assyrian, Chaldean, and Syriac Catholic millet. Paul Rowe describes the contemporary functioning of the Middle Eastern Christians as de facto neo-millet system, and I think it's quite adequate. After the discovery of the ruins of ancient Nineveh in the 19th century, the Assyrian nationalism started to develop, encouraged by the Western missionaries and archaeologists who called local Christians of Assyria and then Assyrians. Modern Assyrians claim descent from the ancient ones. During the World War I, the tragedy of Safed occurred. It was a mass slaughter of the Aramaic-speaking population of the Ottoman Empire. It happened in the same context as broadly known Armenian genocide. Modern Assyrian Syriacs are still deeply traumatized by these events. Since the second half of the 20th century, Syriac and then Aramean nationalists started to develop, stressing Christian Aramean roots and belonging to the Syriac Orthodox Church. In the 20th century, some Assyrian Syriacs, as other Middle Eastern Christians, supported pan-Arabism, but never pan-Islamism. It was a threat. Assyrian Syriacs in Sweden are called Assyrier-Syrianer. Their emigration from the Middle East to Sweden started in 1967 and continues today. There are no official statistics, but the population is estimated at around 150,000, which is about 1.5% of the total population. The majority come from the Tur Abdin region in southeastern Turkey and belong to the Syriac Orthodox Church. In the 1970s, Assyrian Federation and Syriac Federation were established due to the name conflict that split the whole community into two opposing sides. Today, we have a wide range of non-religious organizations, media and football teams, separate from Assyrians and for Syriac Arameans. Now, what was my methodology? I have conducted both quantitative and qualitative research. There was an online survey in English, Swedish, and Arabic answered by 224 Assyrian Syriacs in Sweden, in addition to fieldwork conducted in Stockholm and Södertälje in 2014. Södertälje, as you can see, is a city near Stockholm where Assyrian Syrians constitute 1/3 of the total population. So we can call it an official capital of the group. There are huge Syriac churches and this non-religious institution, which I mentioned before. I conducted 30 semi-structured interviews and 6 focus groups with Assyrian Syriacs, in addition to 20 semi-structured interviews with important actors of the host society. I skip the literature review to read my research questions. Do Assyrian Syriacs in Sweden still have sectarian or now have post-sectarian identities? Why and how is sectarianism used in Sweden to distinguish Assyrian Syriacs from Muslims, very significant others? What kind of sectarianism can be encountered in the Assyrian Syriac diaspora in Sweden? When it comes to the theoretical framework, I opt for a moderate constructivist approach. I believe the sectarian and other collective identities are the product of social construction from both above and from below. In the previous book on Assyrian Syriacs, based on my PhD thesis, I used Benedict Anderson's concept of imagined communities. Just to remind you, Anderson depicts a nation as a socially constructed community imagined by the people who perceive themselves as a part of a group. And I also use a term coined by Michael Billig, banal nationalist. What Billig wanted to say is that the nation to survive must be reproduced every day by its members and media, not only by the flag-waving extremists, inverted commas. Now, when I thought more about the last term, banal nationalism, in the context of today's presentation, another term came to my mind, banal sectarianism. I was very excited to propose a new term. I thought I coined it. Unfortunately, when I checked the internet, I have found the article by Raymond Hinnebusch from 2016, in which he uses the term and even differentiates 3 major variants of sectarianism. And now I'm anticipating Mustafa's question, so I'm quick to answer that by sectarianism, I understand, after Hinnebusch, an identity marker. So Hinnebusch differentiated relatively unpoliticized banal sectarianism, instrumentalized sectarianism when sectarian differences are politicized for instrumental purposes, and militant sectarianism for Hinnebusch equal to jihadism in the Muslim context, but I think that the more general approach would be better. For me, it's any powerful identity which tends to impose one true interpretation of religion. The last concept in the theoretical framework is taken from the article I co-authored. It's majority within the minority versus minority within the minority. Middle Eastern Christians, when they come to Europe, are a double minority, a smaller group within a bigger Muslim immigrant group. However, Assyrian Syriacs in Södertälje are so visible and even powerful that they can be called majority within the minority. A minority is not a minority due to quantitative or so-called objective criteria, such as numbers. What makes a minority is the qualitative aspect of power inequality. Okay, knowing all these things, we can proceed to the DMEC findings. First, the religious identity of the survey's respondents. Most of them identify as Christians, 90% as Syriac Orthodox. There are few people who are religiously lapsed, there are no Muslims. Secondly, the ethnic identity of the survey's respondents. I suppose my biggest finding is that their ethnic identity is far more complex than researchers had previously thought. It's not only about the Assyrian Syriac split and name conflict. I was able to name 8 main ethnic identities and more than 30 of their variants, and I believe there are far more. In the Swedish diaspora, my respondents have developed 2 main ethnic identities, Assyrian and Aramean Syrio-Syriac. And I have to stress that they are members of the same families who choose different elements from their long history to construct their contemporary ethnic identities. Definitely, sectarian identities could be observed. By the way, by sectarian identity, I understand, after Del Satro, a religious identity that may or may not be embedded in the collective identity of one or more ethnic groups and or national identities. In the Assyrian Syriac case, religious denominations are embedded in the collective identities of one ethnic group, which imagine itself as 2 ethnic groups, or even more if we count Chaldeans, but let's not complicate it further. Most interviewees have very complex identities. The majority of Assyrians put their ethnic identity first, while Syriacs and Arameans tend to put their faith first. Middle Eastern churches in the diaspora preserve old religious identities, and secular activists partially exploit old religious identities for social or political purposes. Facebook is full of their selfies with Syriac bishops or other important priests. Assyrian Syriac politicians use church premises to speak to their people and gain their support. And at the same time, they try to strengthen ethnic identities. For example, by organizing seminars and summer camps for the youth, or writing articles and books on the origins of the community, like Johnny Meso, the president of the World Council of Aramean Syriacs, who published a monograph, Arameans and the Making of Assyrians. Additionally, most of Assyrian Syriac leaders present Assyrian and Syriac Aramean identities as being under existential threat. The view, which according to my previous research, is shared by the vast majority of the community members all over the world. Now, let's come back to 2 terms introduced before, banal nationalism and banal sectarianism. I have prepared this graph to demonstrate how the identities of the community members have changed in the diaspora under the influence of churches, non-religious organizations, and media. I have not included all churches, only the most important ones, and I didn't include all the identities. I would also like to draw your attention to these material manifestations of banal nationalism, like bracelets with Assyrian Syriac Chaldean flags, or mugs decorated with a picture of Lamassu, ancient Assyrian winged bull, or banal sectarianism, like Orthodox crosses, preferably golden, worn by some Assyrian Syriacs in Sweden. Despite everyday banal nationalism and or banal sectarianism, occasionally there is a flag wave. For example, Assyrians and Syriacs in Sweden demonstrated together against violence when Syriac Orthodox Bishop Johanna Ibrahim was kidnapped in Syria in 2013. Hinnebusch writes about instrumental sectarianism, which facilitates defensive collective action. And Assyrian Syriacs in Sweden are able to unite when they feel threatened. They try to influence homeland politics, lobbying for recognition of SAFO by Turkey. Of course, Turkey doesn't want to do it, and a safe haven or autonomous region in the Niva Plain in Iraq, which is not very probable. However, they are divided over Syria, whether or not to support Assad. I told you that Assyrian Syriacs in Sweden feel that their identity, or rather identities, are under threat, but they do much to preserve them. They use their churches, organizations, schools, football teams, media, architecture to keep Assyrian and or Syriac identities alive. They have 2 primary schools, Edessa and Ela, which teach Neo-Aramaic language to Syriac and Assyrian children. Swedish authorities dislike such initiatives as potentially leading to religious and ethnic segregation. However, they do not ban such schools. Assyrian Syrians in Sweden, despite being successful and generally well-integrated community, they were even called by journalists the best in the class, feel that they are misrecognized, often taken for Muslims by ethnic Swedes because of the appearance and languages, Neo-Aramaic, Arabic, Turkish, Kurdish, or even mistreated, treated towards when Muslims were significant others. Upon their arrival to Sweden, Assyrian Syriacs were imagining Swedes waiting for them with their arms open only because they were very co-religionists. They were disappointed to discover that Swedes did not favor them over Muslims, who constitute today about 8% of the total population. Thus, when you ask Assyrian Syriacs in Sweden about Muslims, you would hear about misrecognition and mistreatment, painful past, especially SAFO, difficult times living in the Middle East, ISIS, martyrdom, hardships. And finally, Muslim threat to Sweden and naive Swedes who don't do enough to protect European Christian values. Well, in fact, the Swedish authorities have to deal with translocation of sectarian conflict from the Middle East, limited but still a conflict. On the one hand, there were cases of Muslims attacking Christians in Sweden's refugee camps, Syriac churches in Sweden witnessing a series of bomb and arson attacks and threats online sent in Arabic from Muslims in Sweden to the Syriac Federation. On the other hand, there were records of Assyrian Syriacs abusing Muslims in Södertälje. I learned from my interviewees that Muslims were afraid to live in Södertälje. They had a hidden praying room. There were cases of Muslim women harassed by Assyrian Syriacs. So, as I mentioned before, the power relations in this city are specific. Assyrian Syriacs can be called majority within the minority. They are more powerful than Muslims in Södertälje, but only in Södertälje. Interestingly, when in 2015 Swedish television blamed Assyrian Syriacs for Islamophobia, the Bishop Benjamin Atas officially condemned Islamophobia, but community members criticized that television. According to scholars such as Jonas Otterberg, a relatively high level of prejudice against Muslims is a fact in Sweden. This is the issue of a broader society. The attacks on mosques occurred followed with such initiatives as love bombing, showing support to Muslims. Most Assyrian Syriacs with whom I talked perceived Islam as a threat and were afraid that mass immigration of Muslims means bringing the conflict from the Middle East to Sweden. The self-positioning of a Middle Eastern Christian as we are not Muslims, as well as a warning about the Islamic threat to the West, is a broader phenomenon in Europe. Andreas Schmoller writes about racist narratives regarding the problematic Muslim migrants. There is a political party in Sweden that builds its popularity on anti-immigration feelings, Swedish Democrats. Most Assyrian Syriacs are afraid of them, as you can see in this quote where interviewee anticipated apartheid in case of a victory, but there are also community members who support them. Head of Democracy and Diversity Department in Södertälje municipality believe that it's all about inherited hatred. I would say inherited fear. Assyrian Syriacs are politically active in Sweden. According to my research, more than 80% take part in the elections. There are a few prominent Assyrian Syriac politicians. Ibrahim Baylan, Social Democrat and Minister for Enterprise, is probably the most famous. In 2010, in Södertälje, Swedish Democrats were the only party with a majority of immigrants on its electoral list, mostly Assyrian Syriacs. Swedish Democrats got 5 of the 65 municipal seats, and in the last 2018 elections, they have become the third largest party in Sweden. More than 1/3 Assyrian Syriacs in Sweden support ruling Social Democrats. Why some Assyrian Syriacs voted for the far-right anti-immigrant Swedish Democrats? Well, they assume that Swedish Democrats would allow Middle Christians to stay while Muslims would have to leave Sweden. Swedish authorities see the problem and try to mediate between Muslims and Christians from the Middle East. Both religious and secular authorities organized several meetings with Middle Eastern Muslims and Christians to make them cooperate. But such meetings either failed, as in the case of an ecumenical meeting organized by the Mission Church in Södertälje, or did not bring expected fruits. Sectarian identities are very strong and serve several purposes. Only few interviewees didn't want to be labeled as Christians. They chose human or human being identity and stressed their tolerance. But I had a feeling that it was due to very political correctness. One was teacher, other politician. Still, my presentation wouldn't be complete without mentioning individual friendships between Middle Eastern Christians and Muslims. They occur and they give hope for optimism. As one interviewee said, it's a process. It takes time. To conclude, I think sectarianism is a useful concept in the case of Middle Eastern Christians in the diaspora. Most Assyrian Syriacs in Sweden, as I tried to prove, have still sectarian identities. Post-sectarian are rare and rather superficial. Sectarianism is used both by religious and secular leaders to unite and mobilize community members. We can observe banal nationalism, banal sectarianism, and instrumentalized sectarianism. Assyrian Syriacs have translocated anti-Muslim sentiments from their homeland to Sweden. The Swedish authorities want to avoid religious-based segregation and sectarianization. But desectarization is not an easy task. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Marta. That was fascinating. And you know, it was also 1748.
Yeah,
How's
I
that?
know. I know. I was practicing 17 minutes.
Yeah, we could tell. Practice makes perfect. That was great. That was
Thank you.
fantastic. Very great insights into a dynamic that takes place that I don't think many people that engage with sectarianism and the literature with sectarianism tend to see. So thank you for attracting people's attention to what takes place, because that's a very fascinating dynamic. So next we will be hearing from Vicky Panasian. And
yes.
of course, Vicky, Moment, her paper is Monuments, Tolerance and Integration, Solidifying of the Refugee Identity. There you go. So let me know whenever you're ready, and I will begin the clock.
Okay, can you see my screen?
Yes.
Okay, perfect. I'm ready.
All righty, great.
Okay, so hello everyone. My name is Vicky, and today I'm going to be presenting my research project. It's entitled Monuments, Tolerance and Integration, Solidifying the Refugee Identity. This is a project I've been working on for quite some time now, and before moving forward, I'd just like to clarify that during this presentation, I'm going to focus on contemporary international refugee communities with a particular emphasis on two of my case studies, because the pandemic got in the way of my ethnographic research study. So first, there's a brief introduction followed by a historical grounding. I think this is a very fundamental part because it basically governs the way we perceive monuments through sociological and anthropological research done on the topic. Then I'll go over my research question, which will hopefully be answered through two of my case studies. And at the end, I have a few concluding remarks, which should pave the way for further discussion during the Q&A. So to begin with, I'd like to shed light on monumentation in general. So according to the Oxford Dictionary, a monument is a building or statue built to remind people of a famous person or event. But this isn't really the definition I'm using, because we all know that monuments, when it comes to sectarian identity or any kind of national or ethnic identity, the monument itself has, or even the image like we were talking about earlier today, it contains a sort of an ideological baggage. So basic examples of this would be the Statue of Liberty. Just by talking about the statue, people understand which nation and what time frame I'm referring to, which is what I meant by ideology. However, the discourse of ideology and monumentation gets a lot more interesting when we're dealing about monuments that serve and represent diaspora or refugee agendas rather than national ones. For example, I'm an Armenian diaspora member, but I was raised in Lebanon. And I spent my childhood visiting the monument you see on the right of the screen. It's a memorial that every Armenian family visits a few times per year, particularly during the month of April. It's dedicated to the Armenian genocide. However, as previous literature already points out, there are two major issues about having such monuments. These issues are heightened when dealing with diaspora or refugee communities. The first problem is that these monuments have the ability to become sort of like a marker for collective identity. You see groups of people, even sects or people belonging to the same ethnicity, identifying with this particular monument, even after various generations have passed. But the downside is that it also leads to a kind of misrepresentation. So it sort of has the power to disrupt the course of integration and even identification with the host country. For example, going back to the Armenian case, the statue that we see here is that of a praying or pleading helpless child survivor. while in reality, the people who visit it and the people who actually identify with it are third or even fourth generation refugees who have long ago been nationalized to become Lebanese citizens. Yet the monument presents the community in a fragile and helpless manner, which sort of conflicts the narrative that the community is trying to uphold within the Lebanese space and place. So anthropologically speaking, there is a sense of identity conflict that rises from this kind of misrepresentation, which is frequently seen when dealing with diaspora communities. So it's also this kind of cultural conflict that leads to misrepresentation that we see in the picture included in the slide. This is one of the many examples of incidents that happened last summer during the Black Lives Matter movement, when protesters removed half a dozen statues of slave traders in different towns across different nations. So be it in the UK, France, or the US. But this was done around 130 years after these statues were already considered touristic hubs, and some of them had even become national markers, which brings me to my research question. So my research question is, do such cultural or ethnic or sectarian monuments really enhance identification, or do they solidify an event which later on may cause direct harm to various generations of the people it represents? And how does this apply to contemporary refugee discourse? These are questions that I've been trying to answer for over a year now, and the following slides will try to shed light on a few of my major findings by referring to 3 particular monuments. There are actually 4, but one is an exact replica of another, but situated in a different town. So the first case study includes the monument that was unveiled in 2019. This picture was taken in September. A few of you probably remember when the Vatican unveiled the statue of 140 refugees standing on a big boat. This sculpture is currently found in St. Peter's Square, and a replica of it is situated in New Orleans. So the importance of this statue is its representation of refugee people as a vulnerable group whose identity is bound to their origin. But the problem with this concept of origin is that we are linking it to them coming from a boat rather than them having their own cultural, ethnic, sectarian identity. Now, since my analysis was sort of anthropological, I heavily relied on media responses and different regional reactions to this kind of monuments. So one interesting outlook was that a few of the media outlets praised the Pope's openness to including individuals who appear to belong to diverse religious backgrounds. There are 2 media sources that actually stand out. They are the ones that criticize the presence of veiled women, and it triggered a discourse and even like a discussion on Twitter about Islamophobia and whether or not it should be presented in such a public place as St. Peter's Square. However, most of the reports considered this to be like a major positive aspect, which would make asylum seekers feel more quote-unquote welcome. And this is a point I would like to stress on. How could a statue such as this one trigger a sense of acceptance? If all the people being represented seem like helpless victims in need of a host country's salvation, then is the statue not solidifying the refugee identity as the identity of a foreigner? Doesn't this go against the discourse of integration that is propagated throughout different host countries? Also, having in mind the diversity of the people included, does the unification of people coming from such diverse backgrounds really serve a decent purpose? I mean, it's as if we're not leaving any kind of room for these people to identify with their culture, sect, ethnicity, or any kind of identity they'd like to choose to have or even keep. So these were the questions that actually led me to my second case study, which focuses on individual monuments rather than groups. So for the second case study, my primary sources included the statue of the immigrant's mother, which is located in Spain, and the immigrant's void, which is currently in France. Both of these are fairly new monuments put to represent a sense of solidarity with the so-called world citizen who has lost a part of them throughout their journey. This part can either be their children, which is beautifully portrayed by the image of the mother, and it can also be a part of their identity, which is seen on the right of the screen with an individual who gradually loses parts of their body. However, my analysis looks at the portrayal of this refugee despair and melancholia, which sort of takes over their sectarian or ethnic or cultural identity. So as seen on the monument to the right, the solidification of the identity had sort of like led to its disappearance. And interestingly enough, it has disappeared within the water, which is something that one of the media sources commented on, saying that, are you alluding to the fact that this person has come from the waters, like people of the boats and that kind of narrative? So the fact that the bag is the only thing that's left is another theme that was highly criticized, as in what kind of baggage do these people bring to the host country and the host community? However, similar to the statue located at St. Peter's Square, my question is, what does this mean to the individuals or the second or third generation of refugee people who try to seek asylum or even start a new life in their host countries, having in mind that there is very little room for them to not only share their identity, but to also perform it in a sense that would be socially acceptable? So the discourse of identification, as well as the discourse of othering brought about to the refugee, is sort of one that not only hinders the path of integration, but it can also generate a sense of prejudiced response regarding the timeline of the refugee experience. So are they all meant to fade into their host country? What are these monuments really trying to say? These are questions I wanted to answer through the ethnographic fieldwork, but it never came to light. So I'm hoping to do so in the near future. Honestly speaking, when looking at the media sources, none of the 16 monuments I took in as case studies, none of them had a sense of comfort to the people who were trying to integrate within the host country, which sort of triggered a sense of curiosity on my end. So before moving into the concluding remark, I'd just like to focus on the gaps and limitation, which go back to the ethnographic fieldwork and the missing pieces that will hopefully in the near future be complete. To conclude the rest of the presentation, frankly speaking, although these monuments have served to represent the refugee identity, I argue that they encourage the solidification of the refugee discourse, which gives very little room for growth or identification with any kind of cultural background within their host country. So if the refugee individual is always perceived and treated as a victim or someone in need of salvation, then what is the purpose of having all these integration frameworks if we're going to look at refugees and see them as people who are foreigners? This is fundamentally true, and I noticed that this has multiple layers when looking at particularly monuments that represent veiled women or even hint at having any kind of representation of Arab refugees. And the media's reaction was relatively negative to all of the instances of representation. So it's as though the Arab population is battling multiple layers of sociocultural prejudices within different host countries. And interestingly enough, each host country has its own narrative that the people are trying to battle. So one can't help but disregard the impact of the solidification of refugee identities that is represented through this kind of monuments that present people as either very vulnerable or uneducated, or some of them even represent people as sort of aggressive. Therefore, the entire aim of my project was not to interfere with whether or not monuments are harmful, but rather to establish a sense of understanding regarding the negative aspects of monumentation and practicing a certain cultural, ethnic, or even sectarian identity. So I guess that's it on my end. Thank you so much, and I'm looking forward to the discussion.
Wow, okay. Vicky, thank you so much for, I think you guys can hear me. Yeah. Thank you so much for such a fascinating fascinating insight into monuments and what that means, and the discourse of identification. I'm sure people will reach out. I will be one of them, and so we will move on next to. Thank you very much, Vicky. So we will move on next to our very own Mustafa Al-Minshawi, and we will be looking at the discourse of as if. So whenever you are ready, Mustafa, from Lancaster University, our very own co-organizer. Please take it away, my friend.
So can you see my PowerPoint now, Aziz?
Yes.
Thanks so much for the introduction. It's great to be third. And you said acting as if. It's actually acting as if not. The not is really important for the sake of negation, which is the whole point of the story, because I want to give a kind of a disclaimer that my ideas here are very rough cut. It's part of a report that I prepare for CPAD, and I hopefully gonna develop into a manuscript. So all ideas are actually not very polished, that because it's a very closed circle. I had the confidence to make all these bold claims coming across from myself as such. So I'll take you through what I've already done. All missing points can be highlighted as well. So my hypothetical position is that the Syrian president Bashar al-Assad has used de-sectarianization as a strategy in order to reach the same goals of sectarianization. And the goal, of course, is the authoritarian durability in power. So Assad doesn't need to sectarianize, because simply he can de-sectarianize as such. So if I want to confuse you more, it's a sort of sectarianization via de-sectarianization in one way or another. So my analytic framework is, as most of you approach sectarianization from the constructivism. I mainly adopt the middle range, the middle ground constructivism, in which it's about intersubjective meanings with a sense of agency. There's a bit of discourse analysis, and why I am doing that, because it's language is really important, which is the smallest unit in constructivist and discourse analysis approaches as well. This is a lovely quote that that is the main trigger for my research. It says, reality begins with a word. We should be careful with these terms, as everything in the world begins with language. Language is the carrier of ideas that ultimately lead to reality. What comes to mind, the one who is saying this quote is probably Norman Fairclough, critical discourse analysis, or maybe Foucault comes in, or it's all post-structuralists coming in, but it's not. It's actually said by Bashar al-Assad in one of his speeches. That means it shows the importance of just the language constructed by himself, especially if highlighted. And of course, takes me to the dilemma. Before I start my analysis, I need to define what is sectarianism or sectarianization, and it's problematic. Perhaps after spending 5-6 weeks of trying to find a definition, my conclusion, it's a process and discourse. Process, I mean it by I'm quoting here Postel, Hashimi and Postel, the book about sectarianization. It's a process shaped by political actors operating within a specific context, pursuing political goals that mainly involve different elements like political popular mobilization. So here it's really important, this process, because that means it's not about theology, it's not about religion, it's about Sunni Shiism, it's about authoritarianism. As I'm quoting them as well, authoritarianism, not theology, is the critical factor that shapes the sectarianization process. And since I'm not focusing only about the dynamics, the mechanism of this sect making as such, discourse come as important. So I approach discourse as a practice as well as a discourse. And of course, I'm quoting Osama Maqdisi in his lovely book about the history of sectarianization in Lebanon in the 19th, 18th century, when between the Ottomans and Europeans, when it comes a specific part of Lebanon. So actually, because I mentioned discourse, it's really problematic, because if no one knows what is sectarianism, more people doesn't know what is discourse. So probably I fell into another trap of defining what is discourse. So I approach discourse more specifically as a frame. So I use a frame analysis. What I mean by a frame, a search for themes, or actually I'm quoting Jim van Dyke here when he says it's a search for global meanings in different from the local formal meanings of morphemes, lexemes as such. So a frame is a specific keyword, stock phrase, a stereotype image, or source of information and sentences. I do apologize, my PowerPoint are not as polished as Vicky and Marta, but just this is a quote from Robert Entman in 1993. He wrote a very important piece about the frame analysis. So what I found is actually I'm analyzing the speeches of Assad since the start of the crisis in 2011. I'm looking for the master frames. These are actually the bigger frames or mini frames, if I put as such. If you want to take the word frame, swap it with theme, that would be great. So the first element is acting as if not, and of course I'm actually snatching this acting as if not from Lisa Whedon. She wrote an interesting piece about Syria. She noticed phenomena of this simulation, which is based about a simple process that she noticed in the Syrian culture. Because of the repression, the authoritarianism, people are hiding their feelings, their beliefs, the meanings that they have of sectarianism. And instead of this feeling coming in the open, they are actually turned into hidden, falsified, actually just undermined as such. So this is what Assad is doing as a centralized approach. Is if you ask him, the Syria is sectarian society or sectarian state, his answer would be, we are not sectarian. And these are some quotes which are actually brought from his speeches. They are as rough as it is when he is making the claim, actually there's no coexistence or tolerance in Syria, but full integration. And then he is actually emphasizing these meanings in every speech, blending and integration among six ideas, traditions. All these elements complement each other, build a unified national color. Sectarianism, and I love this quote as well, sectarianism in their souls are fire under ashes to remove it. His argument is actually bringing in the salvational element of sectarianism that goes back to Weber, Traulich, and their argument that it's about the division between the sect and the church, and salvation is part of it. We are looking for someone up there to save us, and that savior could be the Jesus Christ, could be God in Islam, but for sectarianism, the secular kind of sectarianism in Assad's discourse is the regime itself. So the regime is keeping the society de-sectarianized as it is. So, and I'm actually carrying more quotes. So the Syrian society has never been sectarian. Why this, and my hope is actually is not to move from the literal meanings into contextualizing all these meanings, because part of the policy of the Ba'athist regime is denying any discourses or discussions of sectarianism. And if you want to actually mention it, you have to ask. It's just recently the great intellectual, Syrian intellectual Michel Kelo, he got imprisoned in 2000s for actually mentioning that the society is sectarian. So he went to prison simply by making this claim, which is actually leading us to this lovely quote from Yassin al-Hajj Saleh, explaining Syrian sectarianism as sectarian chastity. It's no one can discuss it. It's a very pure and neat desectarianized position. And of course, this sense of absolute Syrianism that comes along with what. What is the second master frame? I found what I call in the article, it's bulwarks to sectarianism. So if the Syrian regime is making the allegation that the society is desectarianized, that means there are certain elements, tools, I call the bulwarks to sectarianism in order to save the society from falling into the trap of sectarianism. And the first one is secularism. And of course, that goes back to the classical division between the on religious terms, when secularism is antithetical to religion as such. And once you mention religion, you mention sects, you mention the sectarian meaning coming along. So Assad is making the claim, as I mentioned here in the quote, we don't ask about religion or sect. It's not our business. This is secularism. This is what we want. And if, of course, Assad came under pressure in the revolution because the Islamist opposition forces, thanks to our Saudi and Qatari friends spending all this money into the radical Islamists, he come under the pressure of changing this kind of secularism to prove that he's not atheist, and he comes actually focusing on Almaniya al-Mu'mina. So it's the faithful secularism. So his argument, secularism is not anti-religious, it is part of religion in one way or another. Perhaps I need to explain my terms. And the third master frame is nationalism, Arabism, Syrianism, whatever comes up. Poeman, as Nazih Ayubi is telling us, Pan-Arabism, the Arabs only speak about Pan-Arabism only in words. It's phonetic phenomena. If he put it as such, it's a cultural phenomena that doesn't go into the practical political element of it. So Assad is playing on that, as I'm just quoting, it's a very inclusive concept. So why the nationalism, Arabism is important, I take it back to history as well. The Assad, the father, Hafiz al-Assad, is thinking of nationalism, Arabism as a sort of a way of staying in power as Alawite minority. That means he wants to show that he's unifying all elements of the Syrian society under his kind of legitimate position as a ruler who bring all these kind of different elements coming in one way or another. So yeah, this is the main elements that I approach. How many minutes I have, Aziz? Or am I done?
No, you have some time. You have some time. You have 5 more minutes if you want.
Thanks so much. So I just my main argument here is actually goes back that is Assad is it's sectarianism is not about mentioning it. It's about the discourse of absence. So probably I can be sectarian by the fact of not saying or not being sectarian as such, which makes the Syrian cases very unique because authoritarianism is not about admitting it, it's about denying it. Perhaps I need to go into this discourse of absence as well. Perhaps I need to think out of my research about the role of religion. Is religion as a sort of, as Simon Mabin and just always emphasize, it's a boundary making element in which actually that it's more than about religion, because simply when it comes to the Syrian case, religion is mainly subdued in one way or another. It's about as well the history, how the Assad dynasty is playing on the desectarianization as a sort of legitimating power, which is completely opposite from the cases in areas like Saudi Arabia, Bahrain, Kuwait, where the sectarian element is part of the existence of the ruling family. It's a bold claim, of course, of mine, but my argument is actually, perhaps this is another reason how Assad claims he's different from those enemies in his own words, like the Gulf pivot when it comes to the being sectarian. So he all the time making that comparison. We are different. There's a sense of superiority based on desectarianization as such, which takes me. Perhaps the little challenge, which I really appreciate, if any comments coming along, it's about what is sectarianism in this sense, because I hope by doing that, perhaps we take sectarianization away from the religious attachment, which this point of anchorage that comes along with defining it, as well as the strategies of antagonism, in which, so sectarianism is a process and discourse, and it lies within power relations as well. So part of the sectarianization is resisting it, not necessarily just using it as a tool of dominance from the ruling regime. So, and if I do so, perhaps that would take me away from the state at the point of departure. It's not necessarily about the state, it could be about the other elements as well. So the sectarianism is much more entrenched and deeper than it is. Sorry if I come with more questions than answers and explanations, but perhaps this is the whole point of it. Thank you so much for that. Thank you.
Well done, Mustafa. Thank you so much for sharing this fascinating insight into the discourse, as if not. So it's so interesting to see this these themes that we heard in this previous panel, and I'm sure there's going to be lots of questions. And I think you're right, Mustafa. The whole point is that, right, if we leave here with more questions than answers, well, you're right. That's the whole point. That's why we're all here. So thank you all. Thank you, Mustafa, for this. Thank you, Vicky, and thank you, Marta. Everyone, if you have any questions, please, I could see there are some questions, but I will have some questions myself that I would like to ask the participants. I think for me, there have been two things that I've seen themes here in my own limitation, and my own subjectivity, about that really is highlighted from everyone's talk, from everyone's presentation today. And I think the first one is positionality, and how do these, especially refugees and other demographics can find themselves in a particular terrain. And I wonder, and this is the question that I will ask to Marta. Marta, I think towards the end of your presentation, you mentioned that there was this relationship between, you know, the Christians and the Muslim kind of community, and that they're saying, you know, there is this kind of hope for this relationship. I wonder if you could speak more to this relationship, and I wonder if you could examine the discourse and how there is that interplay between trying to separate themselves, yet at the same time, you know, while having their door open to more for better relations, I think, with the Muslim community. So that's my first question, and then we'll hear that answer, and then I'll ask Vicky the question.
Let me start that the situation is totally different in the Middle East, in the homeland, and in the diaspora. Generally and broadly speaking, the Assyrian-Syriac discourse about Muslims in the diaspora is very anti-Muslim, while on the spot, in Syria, in Turkey, it can be different. I did research, I lived in Syria, I did research in Turkey, and I encountered far more positively, orientated people in the Middle East than in the diaspora. So this is, first of all, when Assyrian Syriacs were coming to Sweden, sometimes they had to over-exaggerate about their situation. Some were really traumatized, for example, the people who were coming from Iraq, but some were coming from Lebanon or Turkey. And they were pretending other kind of immigrants, and the Swedish authorities were not able to tell the difference. Then they could join Assyrian Syriacs Turkish organizations that were powerful, but no, they wanted to make a broad line. We are different. We are not Muslims. We are not Turks. And generally, when you look through their newspapers, Huyodo, it means unity in the Aramaic language, or English, Aina, or other stuff, it's lots of stuff anti-Muslim, especially anti-ISIS, but also anti-Kurdish, which is interesting. This is the main opponent, and I was doing research about Assyrian-Kurdish, relations. And then there are almost no stories of friendship. I encountered these stories of friendship among the younger generation. The people who are, working for the Green Party, the people who are liberals, the people who are trying to, find another kind of identity in the diaspora, and especially people who are very well educated, who lived in specific neighborhood. It was also important. So the atelier is kind of, little bubble. But in Stockholm, I encountered professional Assyrians who had friends among Pakistanis or Muslim people. So I think there is a hope for future, and generally the tendency in Sweden will be more friendships, more cooperation. While the situation changing on the spot in homeland makes people more and more traumatized. The people are many Assyrian Syrians are running away, escaping Middle East, and now the number of Assyrian Syrians is higher in the diaspora than in the Middle East itself. So generally, the prospects in the homeland are really not so good. While in diaspora, they can survive for, I don't know, 1-2 generations. In America, they are already, assimilating. In the Brazil, when I did research, almost assimilated. In Sweden, they have powerful institutions. They are trying to keep everything. There is a hope for 1 or 2 more generations. But it's a complex matter. I just scratched the surface, but I hope I gave you some answers.
Oh, you gave me a lot of answers. There's a lot to say about this. Thank you. That was a very comprehensive answer. The other question I had for Vicky was that the discourse of identification was very interesting, and and you're highlighting basically, as I'm sure everyone will see, is that it's a struggle to identify, and you wonder whether or not the different mechanisms of compatibility with kind of I don't know what to say, a dominating or the dominant kind of identity of the place, or or the leading or the more native kind of terrain. So I was just wondering, did the theme of hegemony, was there any kind of did you touch upon hegemony, or what role does hegemony play in the discourse of identification?
That's a very interesting question. I touched on it for a different project, but kind of the same research group, so I can answer the question. Okay. Basically, what I found was that it depends on the location of the refugee groups. So if they're situated within the Arab world, it's not necessarily an imperial kind of struggle. It's more of getting along, which was the case of the Syrian refugees in Lebanon that I was working on. But when looking at countries that are relatively Western, there was a different kind of struggle. However, the struggle was sort of minimized in places where there was an already established refugee community, which is what Martha was talking about, I guess. So if these people are going into a place that already has some kind of, let's say, Arab community, then it's far easier for them to, get along. So it largely depends on which community we are dealing with and what time frame did their struggle include.
Yeah, thank you. That does answer the question. Good, made me think about that in a different way. Let me take questions from the audience. First one, I think from Mustafa, from Tom. Earlier we heard that Hezbollah is the key militia and most loyal proxy of Iran. However, would you agree that having an ally in Damascus is equally or even more important? Also, Assad and Iran both tend to speak about unifying people, but one narrative tends to be secular, and one is about Islam. Secular was also in quotations. How do you reconcile that as close allies? And then let's go. A question for Marta. I'll ask it all. A question for Marta from Heidieti. My question is for Marta. Thank you very much for interesting presentation. I'm sorry if I missed, but would you mind explaining again how you distinguish ethnic identities and sectarian identities? Is the word sectarianism or the translation in Swedish used within Sweden to refer to the issues you addressed today? For example, is the anti-Muslim sentiment described as sectarian in Swedish society? And then I think it's a general question for, I'll tell you what, why don't we have these two questions and then we'll go for Simon's question and then Bitta's question.
May I answer?
Yes, please.
Do you want to go ahead, Marta?
Yeah. Why not? First of all, I told you that I had all these interviews stuck in Ninivo. So preparing for the presentation, I looked through and none of my interviewees, Assyrian Syriac, used the word sectarian or sect, but the Swedish authorities, like pastors or officials, were sometimes using this word, speaking about this conflict. So they are terribly sectarian, something like that. So the people were labeled from outside as sectarian, but they themselves didn't think about themselves, and, neither in Arabic or in because I spoke in Arabic or English with people, or I had Aramaic translation. So this is the first part of the answer. Then I will read once more because I had it during my presentation that I am using for the purpose of this presentation, because I'm not crazy about using always the same definition. It's rather what suits my paper now. I like the Raymond Hinnebusch definition, and he says that sectarianism is an identity marker combined with norms. And then he speaks about the levels, that this is not a homogeneous phenomenon, but you can look at it like depending on the level of politicization, it is what I mentioned, like banal, politicized, and militant ones. By the way, in the homeland, you could even find militant Assyrian Syriac sectarianism in Iraq and the small Christian militias in Rojava in northern Syria. But it wasn't the focus of my paper, but you can find all the kind of this. So the ethnic and sectarian are overlapping. And in my case, there is a strong component of denominational identity in the sectarianism and the sect, but it's partially overlapping. So this is in my case, not for everyone. Okay, I think I answered. Sectarianism used by the Swedish official, not by the community members, and sectarian ethnic overlapping. There is this denominational component. Like I cannot use the same methodology as Mustafa because there is no Assyrian state, and this is all built, more like really constructed, like in Andersonian terms, using only memory and artifacts, such things. So what suits Mustafa doesn't suit my paper. Thank you.
Thanks, Marta. I think that we shouldn't start fighting now. It's not a good start.
No, not at all. I love your paper. I love your paper.
That would be another level of sectarianism, which we have enough. Thanks so much for that. Tom, thanks so much for the two questions. It's very, very insightful. I start with the second one, in which he said that how Assad and Iran speak about unifying people when their narrative, one is secular and one is Islam. And yeah, it's a great question because it's part of the dilemma. I think the only way is actually perhaps to take religion out of it, or perhaps redefine religion is not about faith, it's not about beliefs. Religion as a viewpoint or a relation of dominance. Peter Berger should read his Sacred Canopy, and I read one of his articles. His main argument is a religion is the meaning making. So actually you dominate by, you have dominant meanings in which is actually try to establish their position within power, whether political or religious. Think of the church, think of the Sunnism, if you put as such. And if we take religion out of the game as such, that means actually the resistance to the sectarian domination is not necessarily about religion. So the resistance of Iran and Assad to the dominant discourse, whatever you call it, the Western or the oppositional force that comes along, it's not necessarily about the Sunni Shiite secular religion. It could be about this kind of the sense of finding tools to stand up to what you do. It's another viewpoint. I'm now writing a paper about the Muslim Brotherhood as a sect movement. So I went back to the sociology of religion and I tried to find what are the criteria. And one important criteria for defining a sect is standing against an established order. So literally sect is against, sect is synonymous with disorder. So perhaps this is why unity is being justified as a threat to sectarianism. So if we are united, that means the society is not sectarian. I hope that I make sense right now because I'm myself confused on that. So just the first question that you asked about Hezbollah and just Iran and Syria. I'm not an expert in Syria or Hezbollah. I wish that someone here had more expertise than I am. Yeah, but perhaps this would link up to the constructivist approach to sectarianism. It's very malleable, very ambiguous. That means it's changing. So you change if politics about change in dynamics, that means actually the tools they use, like sectarianism, should change as well. So perhaps this is part of the strategies of antagonism, if I'm using the words of Foucault here, in which power is everywhere, power is contested, it's never superimposed or settled or stabilized as such. It's all the time dynamic and moving and shifting because there is power and resistance as such. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Mustafa. I think we're going to stick with Mustafa because we have a question from Bitta, and then we'll go to Simon's question because I think Simon's question will be good to, afterwards. So Bitta asks, fantastic talks all around. I have another one for Mustafa. Okay, yeah, another one for Mustafa. Do you think, Mustafa, that linking authoritarianism as opposed to religion to sectarianism might produce another instance of cliche constructivism? That is, how does authoritarianism help elucidate other dynamics, or does it refine the link between Islam and authoritarianism / despotism? You are on mute, Mustafa.
Yeah, sorry. I think this is another way of trying to avoid answering the question because it's very sophisticated for me. I don't have an answer for it. Honestly speaking, I think I need to think over my thoughts. They are as rough as such on that. My understanding, perhaps, well, I try to define what is sectarianism. I try to define what is discourse. Perhaps the next step, we need to define what is religion, because my understanding that we take religion from the erroneously from the sects, the church sect division that happened 5-6 centuries ago. So we think of the church as the dominant position that is actually in alliance with classes, as Trajectories is telling us, are that allied with the ruling forces in society. We think of the sect as the oppositional power that is standing against. This is where religion could be a kind of sacramental, ecclesiastical, whatever you call it. Perhaps religion is a sort of relational, it's a viewpoint. It's not necessarily about the faith element of it. And in that case, actually, we can resituate the religion as a tool of manipulation or as stabilization, because I studied the Muslim Brotherhood, and one interesting use of religion is reaching consensus. So, for example, if I mention a different viewpoint, a world viewpoint, and the only way to suppress, undermine, and falsify this oppositional, rebellious point of view is raising religious Quranic verse or whatever it is. So it's a way of gaining consensus in a way, and that means suppressing any sectarian tendencies. This is the way I can see. This is the way I can see it. This is why Assad could be religious in a way in his secular tendency. This is how sectarianism we can call it secular sectarianism in one way or another. And I think it's important as well, religion emotionally as well, especially in the Iranian case, where these kind of emotions of victimization that come along, we need to stand against the oppressor, as you mentioned as such. Yeah, and honestly, I took note of your the term that you mentioned earlier about cliche constructivism. I think I need to dig deeper into that in order to understand it. Perhaps we can chat later on once I read it and have a bit of clearer view, because while constructivism is another confusing element here, because this is why I'm very keen to use the middle ground one, in which meanings are intersubjective and in which agency is very clear, that a way of fixating any malleability and confusion that come up with that. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Mustafa. Thank you very much for your attempt to elucidate more. I love that term. Thank you, Beta. I thought I was the only one to use that word. Elucidate. Thank you. Okay, let's look at, we'll take the final question, I think, but I think everybody's more than welcome to ask others, but this one is a very good question from Simon for everyone. And let me read it out. I'm really intrigued by the process of exclusion found in what perhaps normatively appears to be an inclusive identity. Can the presenters reflect on whether this is an inevitability bound up in the very idea of sectarianism and desectarianization? Is it possible to find a way of escaping the sectarian trap? So, Marta,
yeah.
Why don't you kick us off?
Yeah, I have an idea, because I was looking for a country that could serve as a model. And the Brazil, which is totally not an obvious choice. There is a huge immigrant group from the Middle East, Lebanon and Syria, back, 100 years. And they are very strong and important component of the Brazilian society. Brazil is a kind of melting pot, but not looking down on people. So this group is very successful, cooperating, and almost no sectarian trap after 3 generations. So it's possible in the diaspora. In Sweden, it's more difficult because Swedes don't want to melt. They really prefer to have borders between them and the groups. So it's a little bit different. While in the Middle East, of course, Pan-Islamism is not a solution, Pan-Arabism not, but if we take national identity, separate Syrian, Iraqi as an umbrella, then all these Middle Eastern Christians that I use as a case, even Assyrians, could identify. For example, when I asked them about their identities, the guys from Iraq were saying, we are proud Iraqi Christians, which was not the case with Syrians so much. We are Suryani, Assyrian, Syriacs, but in Iraq, it was stronger. And it is due to the processes, of course. It's more complex, but I want to give the floor to others.
Okay, thank you, Marta. Vicky, would you like to have a go, please?
Yeah, sure. Okay, so I'd like to answer this from personal experience, living as a refugee, sort of. Yes and no. It actually depends on who's asking, because when dealing with such research studies, and it usually depends on what the definition or what the understanding of sectarianism is. Are you considering sectarianism to be like the Armenian diaspora identity, which is different than the Lebanese identity? In that case, then desectarianizing would not necessarily serve the agenda of the community. However, if you're referring to sectarianism as in the different sects within the Armenian diaspora community, which is usually divided by religion, so Catholic, Orthodox, etc., then in that case, there is the possibility of desectarianizing. So it's actually like a layered thing. It depends on which part of it you are observing. And this is something I noticed when working on newly displaced Syrian people trying to resettle in Canada. and I found parallel results. So generally speaking, in terms of the Arab refugee identity or the Syrian refugee identity, desectarianizing was not a suitable alternative for them. It was more of a cultural thing that they wanted to keep. However, when dealing with their affiliation in terms of a personal scale, then that was something that could have easily been sort of deconstructed in order to fit in with the rest of the people belonging to their community. I hope that answers it.
May I just support Vicky that it is really true that the governments of European or Western countries are interested in desecularization, while the people themselves would rather, keep up their identities as long as it is possible. So I'm really supporting what Vicky said, and this is a true point.
Thank you.
Thank you both. Thank you, Vicky, and thank you, Marta. Mustafa, do you want to have a go at Simon's question?
Yeah, thanks so much for that. I think I'll build up in what Vicky and Marta is referring to, just that, yeah, having that question from Simon, because he wrote a piece about desectarianization and he put 4 points. It's more policy oriented as such. Okay, I'll have a go how to desectarianize. I think my mission for today to problematize, not solve issues, but I'll do my best. I think the first point is actually perhaps democracy. If we think of authoritarianism when it comes to the practice discourse as a tool, authoritarian tool, perhaps having a democratic element that would actually stand up to sectarianism, a society with this sectarian. I don't imagine that the Syrian refugees who go to Germany, they are actually classified as sectarian, but rather as refugees or citizens, whatever identity they come along with. The second element is individualization. I think that sectarianization is about collectivizing. It's about consensus. So once you have individuals being treated as citizens, that subjective domination that comes up on the kind of domination on subjects are actually getting void and null. That means the individual is taken as the point of consideration, a point of departure, and whatever is happening. And I think the third element is perhaps that relates to the two, individualization and democracy, which is the rule of law. I think that part of the issues that to do with sectarianization, it's based on a moral order. So it's a judgmental morality that comes up. It's a very evaluative, value-laden term that if you take that kind of moral aspect out of it, you are judging people, individuals, only by the fact they are citizens within a lawful frame of reference. In that case, no one would resort to different identities as such, even if there's a bit of multicultural, multi-ethnic element in which the sectarian is allowed in. There always are parameters, are contours in which that sectarian identity is not going far with all these kind of the hatred laws that come along, all these kind of legal restrictions put in a way. So I think part of the main problem in the Arab Islamic region when it comes to sectarianism, there's a mixture between this moral order and legal order. The king, either in Saudi Arabia, either in Morocco, either in Qatar, he is not only the legal ruler of the country, he is the moral Muslim ruler as well. And it's evident even in the title as the Amir al-Mu'mineen, the Khadim al-Haramain al-Sharifin, all these titles come along that mix morality with the legality element. And this is really problematic because, yeah, you cannot separate that man either morally or legally as such. So it's part of it. Authoritarianism is the key word. Let's kill it, yeah.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Mustafa. Thank you all for your answers. I think Simon's question was the last question. And we could actually finish a little bit early so we could have a 10-minute extra break. I just wanted to say my final words about this panel. I'm very appreciative for the presenters and for the topics, because I think a lot of the times, it can be sectarianism can immediately invoke this immediate response of Saudi Arabia and Iran and Shia and Sunni. And I think what you know the presenters showed today is that it's you know, it's broadening. You know, what they've done is that they broadened, they showed how broad sectarianism can be in this very large concept, and you know, they helped us shed light on very fascinating, multifaceted issues that are taking place. So I want to once again thank Vicky, I want to thank Marta, and I want to thank Mustafa for their excellent papers. And how about, so it is now. Yes, please. How about we say we will reconvene 3:15, everybody. We will reconvene 3:15, and all the best. Yeah, so thank you very much. See you guys with the next panel 4, which is Discoursing Sectarianism, Rhetoric, Symbolism, and Power. Thank you very much, everybody.